When David Walsh checked out of the Sakura Garden Hotel on March 14, 1984, he thought he was leaving behind 6 ordinary days in Tokyo. But when he returned to Japan 3 months later to retrieve a forgotten watch, he discovered something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The hotel had never existed. If you're intrigued by stories that blur the line between reality and impossible, subscribe now and join the channel to support more content like this. But let's go back to where it all began. David Walsh was a 34-year-old insurance adjuster from Manchester, sent to Tokyo in early March 1984 to handle a complex claim involving a British manufacturing company. The assignment was straightforward: interview witnesses, review documents, file a report. Standard procedure. He'd done it dozens of times across Europe. But this was his first trip to Asia. His company booked him at the Sakura Garden Hotel through their usual travel agency, a mid-range establishment in Shinjuku that promised clean rooms and English-speaking staff. The confirmation letter sat in his briefcase, printed on hotel letterhead with an address, phone number, and reservation code. He arrived on March 8th, exhausted from the 14-hour flight. The taxi driver found the location without hesitation, pulling up to a modest 7-story building wedged between a pachinko parlor and a ramen shop. The lobby was small but tidy, decorated with artificial cherry blossoms and a reception desk staffed by a young woman named Yuki. She spoke broken English, smiled politely, and handed him a key attached to a wooden tag marked Room 504. David noticed the elevator was out of order, so he climbed 5 flights of stairs, his leather suitcase banging against his leg with each step. Room 504 was exactly what he expected: a single bed with crisp white sheets, a small desk, a television bolted to the wall, and narrow bathroom with a shower that dripped constantly. The window overlooked an alley where stray cats fought over scraps. Nothing remarkable, nothing memorable, just another anonymous hotel room in a foreign city. For 6 days, David followed the same routine. He woke at 7, showered, ate breakfast in the small dining room on the first floor, where an elderly cook served miso soup and rice. He left by 8, spent his days in conference rooms and factories on the outskirts of Tokyo, returned by evening, ate dinner at nearby restaurants, and collapsed into bed by 10. He exchanged pleasantries with Yuki at the front desk. He nodded at the cleaning staff in the hallways. He paid his bill in cash on the morning of March 14th, leaving a modest tip, and took a taxi to Narita Airport. The investigation had gone smoothly. The claim was legitimate. David filed his report on the plane back to London, pleased with himself for handling his first Asian assignment without incident. Life returned to normal. He buried himself in new cases, forgot about Tokyo, forgot about the Sakura Garden Hotel. It was just another line item in his expense report, another stamp in his passport. Then in mid-June, David's wife Sarah was cleaning out his travel bag and found his wristwatch wedged in a side pocket. He'd been searching for it for weeks, convinced he'd left it in a hotel somewhere. When he examined it closely, he remembered he'd taken it off on his last night at the Sakura Garden and placed it on the bedside table. He must have packed everything else in a rush the next morning and forgotten it. The watch had been a gift from his father, engraved on the back. It mattered. David called his company's travel department and asked them to contact the hotel. 3 days later, they called back with an update that made no sense. The phone number on the booking confirmation was disconnected. They'd tried multiple times. David suggested they might have the wrong number, so the travel agent tried directory assistance in Tokyo. There was no Sakura Garden Hotel listed in Shinjuku, not under that name, not at that address. David insisted this was a mistake. He pulled out his copy of the confirmation letter, the one with the hotel's letterhead and logo. He read the address aloud. The travel agent checked again. Nothing. David grew frustrated. He'd stayed there for 6 days. He'd paid a bill. He had a key tag in his luggage somewhere. The agent suggested the hotel might have closed suddenly, which sometimes happened with smaller establishments. Unsatisfied, David decided to handle it himself. He had a cousin, Martin, who worked for a British export company in Tokyo. David called Martin and explained the situation, asking if he could stop by the hotel and inquire about the watch. Martin agreed, happy to help. David faxed him the address and a description of the building. 2 weeks later, Martin called back. His voice sounded strange, careful. He'd gone to the address David provided. There was no hotel. The building David described, 7 stories, between a pachinko parlor and a ramen shop, didn't exist. The pachinko parlor was there, and so was a ramen shop, but between them was an empty lot, overgrown weeds, rusted chain-link fence, a faded sign indicating the land was for sale. Martin had asked the shop owners on either side about a hotel. Both looked at him like he was insane. There had never been a hotel there. The lot had been empty for at least 5 years, maybe longer. David felt his chest tighten. He told Martin this was impossible. Martin suggested maybe David had the wrong address, wrong neighborhood. Tokyo was massive, easy to get confused. But David had the taxi receipt. He had the confirmation letter. He had 6 days of memories. Martin promised to check with the ward office, see if there were any records of a hotel at that location, any business licenses, any permits. He'd call back in a few days. When Martin called again, his tone had shifted from confusion to concern. The ward office had no record of any hotel called Sakura Garden in Shinjuku or anywhere else in Tokyo at any point in the past decade. No business registration, no permits, no tax records. Martin had even spoken to a city planner who specialized in zoning history. The empty lot had been purchased by a developer in 1979 after the previous building, a small electronics shop, was demolished. The developer had gone bankrupt before construction could begin, and the land had sat vacant ever since. There had been no structure on that plot since 1978. David hung up the phone and sat in silence. His hands were shaking. He went upstairs to his study and pulled out the folder with his Tokyo paperwork. The hotel confirmation letter was still there, printed on thick cream-colored paper with a cherry blossom logo at the top. The address matched. The phone number matched. He found the taxi receipt from March 8th, the one that showed the fare from Narita to Shinjuku. The destination address was the same. He found the wooden key tag for room 504, tucked in the inner pocket of his suitcase. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the grain of the wood, the weight of it. Real, solid, undeniable. But according to every official record, every witness, every piece of evidence Martin could gather, the Sakura Garden Hotel had never existed. David couldn't sleep. Every night. He lay awake replaying those 6 days in Tokyo, testing his memories for holes, for inconsistencies, for anything that might explain this. But the memories were solid, clear. He remembered the smell of miso soup in the breakfast room, the sound of the dripping shower, the way Yuki bowed slightly when she handed him his key. He remembered the texture of the bedspread, the view from his window, the squeak of the stairs on the third-floor landing. He told Sarah everything. She listened carefully, then suggested the obvious. Maybe he'd stayed at a different hotel and gotten confused. Business trips blurred together. Maybe the travel agency had booked him somewhere else, and he'd misremembered the name. David showed her the confirmation letter. She examined it, frowning. The paper felt real. The logo looked professional. But she'd worked in graphic design before they married. She knew how easy it was to forge documents. Maybe someone's playing a joke, she said. Your colleagues. David shook his head. Nobody at his company knew about this except the travel department, and they had no reason to fabricate an elaborate prank. Besides, Martin had physically gone to the location. The empty lot was real. The absence was real. Over the following weeks, David became obsessed. He contacted the British Embassy in Tokyo, asking if they kept records of hotels that accommodated British citizens. They didn't. He tried calling Japanese directory assistants himself, struggling through the language barrier, asking for any variation of Sakura Garden in Tokyo. Nothing. He wrote to the Tokyo Metropolitan Government, requesting historical zoning records for the specific address. The response came in Japanese, but Martin translated. No hotel had ever operated there. David began to doubt himself. Maybe he'd had some kind of breakdown. Stress-induced amnesia, a fugue state, something clinical. He made an appointment with a psychiatrist. Dr. Brennan listened to his story without interruption, taking careful notes. After an hour, she asked David about his childhood, his relationship with his parents, his marriage, his work stress. David answered honestly. Everything was fine, stable, normal. Dr. Brennan ran him through cognitive tests. His memory was sharp. No signs of confusion or dissociation. She referred him to a neurologist who ordered an MRI. The results came back clean. There's nothing wrong with you physically or mentally, Dr. Brennan told him during their follow-up. But the human mind is complex. Sometimes it constructs false memories to fill gaps, especially during periods of stress or exhaustion. Jet lag, unfamiliar environment, language barriers. These can all contribute. Then explain the confirmation letter. David said, explain the key tag. Explain the taxi receipt. Dr. Brennan had no answer for that. In August, David made a decision that Sarah opposed but couldn't stop. He booked another flight to Tokyo. He needed to see the empty lot himself. He needed to stand where the hotel had been and confront whatever this was. Martin met him at the airport, concerned but supportive. They drove directly to Shinjuku, to the address on the confirmation letter. David stood on the sidewalk between the pachinko parlor and the ramen shop, staring at the empty lot. Chain-link fence, overgrown weeds, cracked concrete foundation barely visible beneath the vegetation. The lot was maybe 40 feet wide, exactly the width a 7-story hotel would need. But there was nothing there, no evidence of recent demolition, no liberty. The weeds looked years old, undisturbed. Martin watched David's face. You really stayed here? I really stayed here, David whispered. They went into the ramen shop. Martin spoke to the owner in Japanese while David sat at the counter, numb. The owner was in his 60s, had run this shop for 23 years. Martin translated. The lot had been empty the entire time. Before that, an electronics shop. Never a hotel. Never any building tall enough to be 7 stories. The owner remembered the lot being cleared in 78 or 79. Nothing since. David pulled out the wooden key tag and set on the counter. Room 504, he said, pointing at the engraved number. The owner picked it up, examined it, shrugged. Just a piece of wood. Could have come from anywhere. That night, Martin took David to dinner. Tried to lighten the mood, but David barely spoke. He kept thinking about Yuki at the front desk, the elderly cook, the cleaning staff. Where were they? If the hotel never existed, who were those people? Actors? Hallucinations? And why? What was the point? The next morning, David asked Martin to drive him to the British manufacturing company he'd visited during his original trip. He needed to confirm that part was real. The factory existed. The managers remembered him. The claim he'd investigated was in their files. Everything about his work trip was documented and verifiable. Everything except where he'd slept. On the flight back to London, David made a choice. He would stop investigating. He would accept that he'd never understand what happened. Maybe it was an elaborate hoax. Maybe it was something stranger. But continuing to chase answers was destroying him, straining his marriage, consuming his thoughts. He placed the wooden key tag in a drawer and tried to forget. But the Sakura Garden Hotel wouldn't let him go. 3 years passed. David buried himself in work, took on more international assignments, traveled to Munich, Brussels, Singapore. He never mentioned Tokyo. Sarah stopped asking. The drawer containing the key tag remained closed. Life moved forward. Then, in November 1987, David received a letter at his office. No return address. Japanese postage. Inside was a single photograph, slightly faded, showing the exterior of a 7-story building. The Sakura Garden Hotel, exactly as David remembered it. The cherry blossom sign above the entrance. The narrow facade wedged between 2 other structures. And standing in front of the entrance, barely visible but unmistakable, was David himself, carrying his leather suitcase, caught mid-step as if entering the lobby. His hands trembled as he flipped the photo over. On the back, written in neat English, "You were there, March 1984. No signature, no explanation." David showed the photograph to Sarah that evening. She stared at it for a long time, her face pale. "Who took this?" she asked. "I don't know." "David, this doesn't make sense. If the hotel never existed, How can there be a photograph of it? I don't know. She looked up at him, and he saw fear in her eyes. Someone's messing with you. This is cruel. David contacted Martin again, faxed him a copy of the photograph. Martin took it to a colleague who specialized in photo analysis. The assessment came back a week later. The image appeared genuine, not manipulated or doctored. The film stock and development process were consistent with mid-1980s photography. The shadows, perspective, and grain all indicated an authentic photograph taken with a standard 35mm camera. If it was a forgery, it was extraordinarily sophisticated. Martin had another idea. He took the photograph to elderly residents near the empty lot, people who'd lived in the neighborhood for decades. He showed it to shopkeepers, to the manager of the pachinko parlor, to regulars at the ramen shop. Most shook their heads, confused. But one woman, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Takahashi, stared at the photo for nearly a minute before speaking. Martin translated her response over phone to David. She says she remembers something. Not the hotel exactly, but a building. She's not sure when. Maybe the early 80s. She remembers walking past and thinking it looked like a hotel, but she never paid much attention. Then one day it was gone. She assumed it had been demolished, but she doesn't remember construction crews or noise. It was just gone. Does she remember when? David asked. She thinks maybe 1984. Spring or summer. She can't be certain. David felt his pulse quicken. Asked her if she ever went inside. Martin asked. Mrs. Takahashi shook her head. She'd only seen it from the street. A few times, maybe, then nothing. Over the next few months, David received 2 more photographs. Both arrived with no return address, both with Japanese postage. The second showed the hotel lobby. Yuki stood behind the reception desk, smiling at the camera. The artificial cherry blossoms were visible in the background. The third photograph showed a hallway, dim lighting, a sign pointing to rooms 501 to 507. The carpet pattern matched David's memory exactly. Sarah wanted him to go to the police. David refused. What would he tell them? That someone was sending him photographs of a place that didn't exist? That he'd stayed in a hotel with no record? They'd think he was insane. Instead, David did something desperate. He placed an advertisement in the international section of the Japan Times, Tokyo edition. The ad was simple. Seeking anyone with information about the Sakura Garden Hotel, Shinjuku, March 1984. Please contact. He included a P.O. box number. For 6 weeks, nothing. Then a letter arrived. The handwriting was shaky, written in English but with awkward phrasing. The sender identified himself as Kenji Yamamoto, a former taxi driver. He wrote that he'd seen the advertisement and remembered picking up a foreign passenger from a hotel matching that description in March 1984. He'd thought about it for weeks before deciding to respond because the memory bothered him. He distinctly remembered the hotel being there 1 week, then gone the next. He'd driven past that intersection hundreds of times. The empty lot had been there for years. Then suddenly, for a brief period, a building appeared. Then it vanished again. Kenji included his phone number. David called immediately, speaking through Martin as a translator. Kenji's story was consistent. He remembered the hotel existing for perhaps a week or 2 in March 1984. He'd picked up and dropped off several passengers there. Then it disappeared. He'd convinced himself he'd been mistaken about the location, that his memory had failed him. But the advertisement stirred everything up again. Did you go inside? David asked. Once. Kenji said through Martin. I used the bathroom in the lobby. It was a normal hotel. Nothing strange. Do you remember the woman at the front desk? Young woman. Polite. I don't remember her face. David asked a question that terrified him. Do you think the hotel was real? Long silence. Then Kenji answered, I think something was there, but I don't know what it was. David became a ghost in his own life. He functioned at work, came home, ate dinner, but his mind was always elsewhere. Sarah grew distant. She'd supported him initially, but 3 years of obsession had worn her down. They argued. She accused him of choosing a mystery over their marriage. He couldn't explain why he needed answers. He just did. In January 1988, David made a decision that changed everything. He would return to Tokyo one more time, stay near the empty lot, and watch. If the hotel had appeared once, maybe it would appear again. Maybe there was a pattern. Kenji's testimony proved David wasn't insane. Something had been there. Others had seen it. He just needed to understand when and why. Sarah didn't try to stop him. She'd already begun sleeping in the guest room. David arrived in Tokyo on February 3rd. He rented a small apartment 3 blocks from the empty lot and took a leave of absence from work. Martin thought he'd lost his mind, but helped him get settled. David spent his days watching the lot from various positions: the ramen shop, the pachinko parlor, a bench across the street. He took photographs every few hours, documenting that nothing changed. Weeds, fence, emptiness. Weeks passed. David filled notebooks with observations, weather patterns, pedestrian traffic, anything that might reveal a clue. He interviewed more locals through Martin's translation. A few remembered something vague about a building, but most insisted the lot had always been empty. Their certainty made David question everything again. On March 7th, David woke at dawn with a feeling he couldn't name, dread mixed with anticipation. He walked to the lot as sunrise broke over Shinjuku. Everything looked the same. He bought coffee from a vending machine and sat on his usual bench, watching. At 8:47 a.m., a businessman walked between the pachinko parlor and the ramen shop, moving with purpose as if entering a building. But there was no building. The man simply vanished into empty air. David jumped to his feet, spilling coffee down his jacket. He ran across the street, ignoring traffic. He reached the fence and stared through the chain link. Nothing, just weeds and broken concrete. But he'd seen it. The man had walked into nothing and disappeared. David stayed there all day, barely moving. Around 6:30 p.m., he saw it again. An elderly woman carrying shopping bags walked between the 2 buildings and vanished. Not quickly, gradually, like she was being erased from view. David's throat tightened. He climbed the fence, tearing his trousers on the top links, and dropped into the lot. He walked to where the woman had disappeared. His feet crunched on dead grass. He reached out, fingers grasping at empty air. Then his hand touched something solid, cold, smooth, like glass but not quite. His fingers traced an invisible surface, vertical, stretching higher than he could reach. He pressed his palm against it and felt a vibration, subtle but unmistakable. He stepped forward and his hand passed through. The sensation was like pushing through ice-cold water. His arm disappeared up to the elbow. He couldn't see it. Just empty air where his arm should be. David pulled back, gasping. His arm was fine. No damage. But he could feel something on the other side. Warmth. Air movement. The faint sound of voices. He knew what he had to do. David took a breath and stepped forward. The cold sensation enveloped him, passed through his chest, his face, his entire body. For one terrible moment, he felt like he was drowning. Then suddenly he was standing in a lobby. The lobby, cherry blossoms, reception desk. And behind the desk, Yuki, exactly as he remembered, looking up at him with polite surprise. "Mr. Walsh," she said, smiling. "Welcome back." David's legs nearly gave out. The lobby was real, solid. He could smell the faint scent of jasmine incense. Behind him, glass doors showed a view of Shinjuku street traffic. People walking past, normal evening activity. He turned and looked outside. From this side, the hotel existed. Cars and pedestrians moved normally. But when he looked carefully, he noticed something wrong. The people outside moved in loops. The same businessman walking past every few minutes. The same woman with a stroller, repeating, cycling. "Where am I?" David whispered. Yuki's smile didn't change. "The Sakura Garden Hotel, of course. This place doesn't exist. You're standing in it." David felt reality bend around him. "Why? What is this?" Yuki tilted her head slightly. "A place for travelers who need to be somewhere that isn't anywhere. You needed us in March 1984. So we were here. I don't understand." "Few do. But you came back. Most don't come back." She reached under the desk and pulled out a wooden key tag. "Room 504. "Your room is ready, Mr. Walsh. It's always ready." David stared at the key. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to push back through that invisible barrier and return to the empty lot. But he'd spent 3 years searching for answers. He took the key. The elevator worked this time. 5th floor. The hallway was exactly as he remembered. He unlocked room 504 and stepped inside. His watch was there on the bedside table, right where he'd left it in March 1984, 4 years ago, waiting. David sat on the bed, holding his father's watch. The second hand ticked normally. The engraving on the back was exactly as he remembered. To David, with pride, Dad. He strapped it onto his wrist and felt the weight of it real and solid. Everything in this room was real. The dripping shower, the view of the alley. But outside this window, he knew, was an empty lot. 2 realities occupying the same space. He went back downstairs. The lobby was empty now. No juki, no guests, just silence and the hum of fluorescent lights. David walked to the glass doors and looked out at Shinjuku. The looping pedestrians continued their cycles. Same businessman. Same woman with stroller. Background noise on a stage. You're wondering if you can leave. David spun around. An old man stood near the elevator, wearing a dark suit that looked decades out of style. His face was weathered, eyes sharp. He hadn't been there a moment ago. "Who are you?" David asked. "I stayed here once. 1953 Korean war. I was a supply officer. Stopped in Tokyo on my way to Seoul. 3 nights. When I came back in 55, the hotel was gone. Took me years to find my way back inside." The old man smiled faintly. "Name's Richard Burton. Not the actor. Just a man who couldn't let go of a mystery. How long have you been here?" "Hard to say. Time moves differently. Sometimes I leave, walk back to the barrier, and it's 1987 outside. Sometimes 1991. Once it was 2003. I saw cars I didn't recognize, buildings that shouldn't exist yet. Then I come back here, and it's always the same. Always a Sakura garden. Always waiting." David's chest tightened. "I don't want to stay here." "Then don't. Walk out. You can leave any time. That's the trick, you see. We're not trapped. We trap ourselves." Richard walked to one of the lobby chairs and sat down heavily. "But you'll come back, just like I do. Because out there, nobody believes you. Out there, you're the man who stayed in a hotel that doesn't exist. You're crazy, obsessed. Your wife leaves you. Your friends avoid you. But in here, it's real. In here, you're right. That's not true. I found others who remember. Kenji, the taxi driver. Mrs. Takahashi. Vague memories. Uncertain recollections. Enough to keep you hoping. Never enough to prove anything. That's how it works. The hotel gives you just enough to keep searching." David walked to the doors and pressed his hand against the glass. "Why? What's the purpose?" "I stopped asking years ago. Maybe there is no purpose. Maybe it's just a crack in the world, a place that shouldn't exist but does anyway. Or maybe it's a test. Maybe it's waiting to see who can walk away." David thought about Sarah. Their apartment in London. His job. His life. All of it felt distant now, like something that happened to someone else. 3 years of obsession had burned those bridges. If he went back now, what would he return to? Divorce papers? Unemployment? A reputation as a lunatic who chased ghosts in Tokyo? But staying here meant accepting that he'd never fully exist in the real world again. He'd become like Richard, unstuck in time, drifting between a hotel that shouldn't exist and a world that had moved on without him. "I'm leaving," David said. Richard nodded. "You will, and you'll come back. They always come back." David walked to the doors, pushed through them, and stepped onto the Shinjuku sidewalk. The looping pedestrians continued their cycles, oblivious. He walked between the pachinko parlor and the ramen shop, felt the cold barrier pass through him, and stumbled into the empty lot. Night had fallen. The fence rattled in the wind. Traffic sounds from the main road. Tokyo, real and solid and indifferent. Martin found him 2 hours later, sitting against the fence, shivering. David was holding his father's watch. Martin drove him back to the apartment, made him tea, asked no questions. The next morning, David booked a flight back to London. He never told anyone what happened in the hotel. He filed for divorce. Sarah had already met someone else. He quit his job, moved to a smaller flat, took work as a freelance consultant. Years passed. The watch stayed on his wrist. Sometimes he'd stare at it and remember Yuki's smile. The cold barrier. Richard Burton sitting in the lobby, trapped by his own need for answers. In 1995, David received one final photograph. Japanese postage. No return address. The image showed the Sakura Garden Hotel lobby, empty except for one figure sitting in a chair, Richard Burton, looking directly at the camera. And in the background, barely visible through the glass doors, David could see himself standing in the empty lot, hand pressed against an invisible barrier. On the back, in the same neat handwriting, "The door is always open." David burned the photograph. He sold his father's watch to a pawn shop. He stopped reading about Tokyo. He forced himself to forget. But on certain nights, when sleep wouldn't come, he'd lie awake and wonder if the Sakura Garden Hotel was still there, waiting in the space between what exists and what doesn't. And he'd wonder if Richard was still sitting in that lobby chair, watching the looping pedestrians, unable or unwilling to leave. David never went back, but he never stopped wondering if he should have stayed.